Hello, everybody. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate World Talk Radio Network, where our mantra is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. The views of the guest may not represent those of the host or the station. Folks, you need to listen to my guest today. What a phenomenal book. This is Meriel Schindler's first book, and I'm going to introduce Meriel, but I want to give you history. Meriel Schindler is an employment lawyer, partner, and head of a team at Withers LLP, a law firm, and is a patron of Arvon, the writing charity. She lives in London with her husband, Jeremy, and has 3 adult children. This is her first book, The LOST CAFE Schindler, One Family, 2 Wars, and the Search for Truth. I want to welcome Meriel Schindler to Chatting with Betsy. Welcome, Mariel.
Thank you so much, Betsy. It's lovely to be on your show, and it's an honor to be part of a podcast like this. So, yes, I thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. I have to tell the audience, for the first book, I mean, I don't know what you're going to do for your second act, but because you hit it so far out of the ballpark. The research that you did, I mean, walking the path that your, relatives took during the war. But I always ask every author, and I'm going to ask you, what motivated you, inspired you to write this phenomenal book? And thank you for writing this book also.
Thank you so much, Betsy. The reaction to the book has been stupendous. It's been amazing. I was saying before we went on air that, I wake up every morning to emails from people from all over the world who say how much they've enjoyed it and how much it's touched them. So I am profoundly grateful to my readers. What motivated me to write the book was I had a difficult relationship with my father. He was a difficult man who didn't always tell the truth. And when he died in 2017, we were clearing out his cottage and realized that there were a heck of a lot of papers are lying around that we needed to deal with. There were photo albums going back to pre-First World War Europe. There were documents with Nazi swastikas on them that I needed to figure out what they were. And there were sort of extraordinary other documents. He had hired private detectives to follow me and my sister, for example. So there were lots of really difficult documents to deal with. And so we scooped up what we thought was relevant and left. And then I basically had this trunk of documents I needed to do something with. And I didn't really touch them for about a year after his death. But the thing that really drew me into the story was the pictures, the photos in the album. And like so many family albums, there were no names under the photos. And I knew that some of my relatives had died in the Holocaust. I didn't really know who, and I didn't really know what had happened. And I kept going back to the photos, and somehow those images tugged me into the background, tugged me into 1938, and I wanted to know who they were. And so I started researching, and I researched at weekends and in evenings. I have a full-time job as a lawyer, as an employment lawyer in London, so this was very much a weekend hobby. And gradually I got drawn into this extraordinary story about the cafe that my grandfather had founded. And it was just an absolute pleasure researching it. Some of it was a bit painful, but it was a real joy to do the research and to honor the people in my family who didn't make it out. I know I thanked you for writing this book. I want to just tell the audience and put this in perspective. I am Jewish. I was raised Jewish. I learned about the Holocaust at a very young age. We need to see and read books like yours, Mariel, so we don't forget about what happened. And that's just my personal soapbox that I will say, because the Holocaust survivors are dying. Let's face it. There's not going to be many left. After they're gone, I mean, they already say it's a hoax. After they're gone, there won't be anyone left to say, look at the tattoo on my arm.
So books like yours are so important.
I couldn't agree more, and I think you're absolutely spot on, Betsy. I mean, you know, and there is something about the fact that generation of survivors and perpetrators is nearly gone. Basically, that we need to find fresh ways of telling this story. And the way I see it, the cafe was essentially an eyewitness to history. This cafe, founded by my grandfather on the main street in Innsbruck, in the Tyrol, in Western Austria, was the place that everyone went. So literally anything and everything that happened in that town either happened in the cafe or in the street outside. And so you can tell the Holocaust story through the eyes of the cafe. And that was what intrigued me when I came to write the book, was to be able to do that in that format.
Yes, the cafe is a character in the story of huge, and it sounds wonderful. I mean, it's like I just want to jump through time and be there. And because I know of history and personal history, I want to tell the audience, because we have a lot of young people that listen, Jews were not ever fully accepted in Europe. Even though they lived there, some relatives could have been, families could have been in any of those countries any number of years, but they were considered Jews. They weren't considered Polish Jews or Austrian. They were separated. They were never fully accepted. And you talked about a Kristallnacht. And was your grandfather really there, or is that a made-up story by your dad?
No, my grandfather was really there. Yeah, my grandfather was really there. My father did make up stories, and that one of the peculiar things about this tale is that as I was growing up, the story that I absolutely believed, because who would lie about something like that, was that my grandfather was beaten up by Nazis on Kristallnacht using my father's toboggan. Now, that story is completely true. The bit of the story that was not true was that my father witnessed it. My father did not witness that. He was safely in London. He was age 13, and he had been spirited out of Austria, and he was safely in London. And I have got incontrovertible evidence of that, despite the fact that he always said that he witnessed it. Now, this takes us to the question, I suppose, of memory, which is, my father is no longer here. I can't ask him whether he understood that he was lying about it. People's memories are often faulty about traumatic events. It is possible that he believed he was there, but I know he wasn't. And so, in a sense, we have to settle on the fact that perhaps he believed he was there.
And I also want to point out, Mariel, that the Jewish people served in these wars. They served in the Austria-Hungary War. They served World War II, but even before that, they served, but yet they weren't considered and accepted into society. And the people who did Kristallnacht, they were beaten by people that they knew. I just want to put it in perspective for young people. Can you imagine living in an area your whole life and you're beaten to near death or central concentration camp by people who were your friends, who
I know, it's extraordinary.
Business with?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, one of the interesting things about that, you're quite right, Betsy. there was a sort of interesting period around Jewish acceptance in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a big empire. I mean, it extended, it wasn't just the Austria we know today, but its borders stretched right down, down into Italy and down into and across Eastern Europe, into what's now Poland, etc. And in that, mostly you're right, the Jews were not fully accepted by the Kaiser who was in charge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There was an interesting moment in 1867 when Kaiser Franz Joseph realized Jews were useful to him, and he then in quite an act of sort of liberty in a sense, he allowed Jews to settle anywhere in his empire. And as a result of that, he unleashed what can only be described as a sort of tidal wave of human movement. And Jews moved all the way through his empire. Many of them settled in Austria. And that's how my family ended up moving from Bohemia into the main part of Austria, and from Upper Silesia into the main part of Austria. And so they were accepted for a brief golden period between about 1867 and about 1890. And then things started to go bad again, and anti-Semitism simmered beneath the surface. Jews served very loyally and very bravely in the First World War on behalf of the Kaiser, on behalf of the Austrian Empire, and but they were largely blamed for the loss of the war after the First World War. When it came to the Second World War, of course, they didn't get to serve. They got hounded out of the Reich. Jews did not serve in the Second World War.
And you didn't know that you were Jewish when you were growing up, Mariel? Your father didn't want you to know? When did you find out that you were Jewish?
Well, we knew, but it was more the fact that he told us we shouldn't tell anyone we were Jewish. Now, I mean, I think that's quite odd nowadays, but I think for him as a child of the Holocaust, he believed that being Jewish was dangerous, and therefore the simplest thing was not to tell anyone. So in a sense, it was a protective measure.
Oh, yes, I can understand that. I live in New Jersey, in America, and I witnessed anti-Semitism firsthand. My dad grew up in New Jersey. He faced anti-Semitism. My mom was brought up in the Bronx in New York, and she didn't face any anti-Semitism until she came to New Jersey. And she was shocked, absolutely shocked, that people would say things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the cafe, so I'm probably jumping ahead here because I get so excited. How did the business get taken over by the Nazis? And your cover, I have to say, your cover of your book, and I know it's different in America than in England, it's just fascinating. You see Hitler there with his soldiers. And was that in front of your cafe?
That particular picture of Hitler is it's a couple of streets away from the cafe. It's outside the main railway station.
Wow. And the Nazis themselves, they took over the Cafe Schindler.
Yes, I mean, sort of going back in time. So the cafe itself was founded in 1922 when my grandfather returned from fighting on the Southern Front in the First World War. And that was a pretty murderous and horrible war. I mean, all wars are horrible, but this was particularly diabolical because it was fought on mountainside. So you were as likely to be killed by an avalanche as you were by a sniper's bullet. So he managed to survive that and returned to a country that was economically utterly destitute. And in a sense, in an act of defiance, an act of almost frivolry, he founded a cafe. And he founded a cafe in which music was played, in which good cake was served, good coffee was served, where people could come and have fun and could dance. And it was an extraordinary success. And it was an oasis, I think, in what was really quite a difficult economic period for Austria after the First World War. And roll on to 1938 when the Nazis arrived in Innsbruck in Western Austria. One of the first things they did was they wanted to move into our house, which they did. They evicted us from our house, and then they wanted my grandfather to sell the cafe. And they forced him to sell at an undervalue to another Nazi. And that Nazi took over the cafe, and he renamed it Cafe Hebel. And he ran it for 7 years, essentially as a Nazi officers' drinking club. And so, again, it was a roaring success in that guise. And once the Nazis had lost the war in 1945 and largely scarpered into hiding, my grandfather was one of the very, very few Jews who returned to Austria. He loved Austria, he loved the Tyrol, he loved the mountains, and he loved his cafe. And the cafe had been bomb damaged, and he basically built it up again and reopened it to great acclaim in the early 1950s. Sadly, he died in 1952, and my father then inherited the cafe. And my father was a terrible businessman, and he fell out with his cousin with whom he'd inherited the cafe, and the cafe had to be sold. So the cafe was then sold, and the name essentially disappeared off the high street, but it lived on in people's hearts. People still remember the fun they'd had at the Cafe Schindler. And the extraordinary thing happened about 10 years ago when a young restaurateur who knew nothing about our family or the cafe moved to Innsbruck and thought, well, I'd quite like to open a restaurant, a cafe in the same building. And no matter who he spoke to, whether it was the licensing officer, the planning officer, his family, they all said, it's got to be called Cafe Schindler. He was like, yeah, who are these people? And he went to the local archives, typed in our name, and lo and behold, all these incredible images came back of the cafe in its heyday in the 1920s. And he thought, bingo, I've got a ready-made heritage here. So he called it the Schindler, Das Schindler, and it's now a thriving cafe again. And the really exciting thing is that this year, in 2022, it will celebrate its centenary. So that's 100 years of history there in that building. Now, okay, it wasn't there all the time, but it is, I think, the only previously Jewish-owned business that is still going in Innsbruck.
That's amazing. That's really incredible that your grandfather came back and was able to get his business back, because so many lost their businesses, homes. I mean, they were taken over, they were bombed, or they were taken over by other people who didn't want to give it back to the Jewish people.
Correct.
And
yeah.
So that's really incredible. And I have to say this before I forget in the interview, the recipes that you have in the book made me hungry. They sound so
good. No, there are some. I wanted to make it slightly different, so there are some recipes at the back of the book, so that you can kind of look at that and think, well, actually, you know, there's something. It is a slightly different family history in that it's got recipes, it's got local history. It's a book really that you know, that there's no book that's been written about this area and what happened to the Jews in this area.
I have to tell the audience, because I get so passionate, you have to buy this book. And I can say this. My husband is deceased, but he would have loved your book. My husband loved World War II history, you know, World War I. He would have loved your book. I just think it's so rich in history. And, you know, I learned about the history because, you know, in school I learned about World War I, but you went into very much detail, which I wasn't taught in history.
No,
as
this
I told you
a
earlier,
lot of it isn't taught. Yeah.
Yes, and I know if anyone's a history buff, you have to buy this book. It's an incredible story. I have to ask, because people hear the name Schindler, are you any relation to Oskar Schindler? And did your father tell you that you were related to Oskar Schindler?
That's a very good question. Yes, I mean, the name is a bit magic in the sense that obviously people always link it to Oskar Schindler, and my father was a great one. I told you he didn't always tell the truth. He was a great one for claiming kinship with all sorts of very famous people, from Franz Kafka to the writer to Oskar Schindler. Now, I have looked into it, and I mean, first of all, Oskar Schindler was a card-carrying Nazi. He was not Jewish. He was a member of the Nazi Party. He did great things because he realized how appallingly the Jews were being treated, and he saved, obviously, several thousand Jews. So, but he wasn't Jewish himself. And it is feasible that we are in some way linked to him way generations back, because he comes from the same area of Upper Silesia. But I can trace no actual blood relationship with him. So no, I don't think we are related.
And also, your father told you that you were related to one of the doctors that Hitler's mother went to?
Yes, I mean, that was one of the rather bizarre stories that my father talked about. He said that his uncle had been a Jewish doctor in Upper Austria, and that he had treated both Hitler's mother and Hitler himself as a young man. Now, given that my father told so many fantasy stories, I didn't really ever believe him, but that actually was one of the stories that turned out to be true. And it was indeed the case that there was a doctor called Dr. Bloch who lived in Linz in Upper Austria, Linz being Hitler's favorite city in Austria. And in 1907, a middle-aged woman came into the good doctor's surgery complaining of terrible chest pains. And the doctor took her name, and her name was Clara Hitler. And he examined her, and he realized that essentially she had advanced breast cancer. There were lumps in her breast, and she needed an operation. He gave her some painkillers and said, look, come back in a day or so when you have your family with you, and I will explain what needs to happen. And sure enough, a couple of days later, Clara Hitler turns up with young Adolf Hitler, age 17, in tow. And the doctor explains that Clara Hitler is very ill and will need an operation. And at this point, Adolf Hitler bursts into tears. He clearly adores his mother and says, well, is there no hope for my mother? And the doctor explains that there is some hope, but it is a very difficult situation. He then swings into action. Adolf Hitler says everything must be done for Clara Hitler, and the good doctor swings into action, and he arranges the operation. He is physically present at Hitler's request during the operation, and immediately after the operation is over, he hurries over to see Adolf Hitler and Clara Hitler's other kids to say, look, the operation has happened, it's gone as well as can be expected, but, it's early days. And over the next year, just under a year, he then takes enormous care of Clara Hitler. She makes a little bit of a recovery, is out of bed, can go to market, etc. But unfortunately, obviously, she becomes ill again. He takes very good care of her, ultimately until her death in December 1908. And he is the one who fills out her death certificate. Now, Adolf Hitler, age 17 or 18 at that point, is the one who pays the bills, and he shakes the doctor's hand and says, Dr. Bloch, the Hitler family will be eternally grateful to you. And he keeps his word. So roll on to 1938, so 30 years later, Dr. Bloch is still alive, and when Hitler arrives in Linz in his big cavalcade with all the screaming crowds and the Heil Hitlering and the planes overhead, one of the things he asks his cronies in Linz is the good doctor still alive? And they say, yes, he's actually still alive. And Hitler looks at them and says, well, if all Jews were like Dr. Bloch, we would not have a problem. So it was it was like he had his own pet Jew, his own person he actually did like and respect. And Dr. Bloch, I think, was quite proud of that fact. And what that ultimately meant is that although all of his patients were taken off to concentration camps or committed suicide, a lot of them committed suicide in Linz, he was untouched, and he didn't have to move out of his flat, and that became a sort of center for trying to get the Jews out of Linz. And he made multiple trips to Vienna to help with emigration of Jews out of Austria. And eventually in the early 1940s, he did himself emigrate to New York, And the reason I know all of this, and the reason I know it's all true, is that the wonderful Washington Holocaust Museum has his autobiography, his handwritten autobiography in German, where he explains everything that happened. And so he was essentially protected by Hitler. He was the only Jew in the entire German Reich who Hitler liked, respected, and protected.
Wow, that is so incredible. That is just leaves me speechless that, Hitler must have really admired this doctor to protect him.
Yeah.
That's just phenomenal beyond words. You were estranged from your dad. After you wrote this phenomenal book, did you feel any closer to your father? How did your father feel about your book? And did it bring you closer to your dad?
This was a book I could only write after he died, and I only thought of writing it after he died. It started off I'm a bit of an accidental author in that it started off with me wanting to just find out who was in the pictures in the photo albums, and then I decided I was going to write up a bit of a story for my kids about what had happened and include some recipes. And the more I spoke to other people about it, the more they went, "This is an incredible story. You've got to write it up properly as a book." So that's what I then did. And how would my father have reacted? Well, it's a very good question, Betsy. He would have loved the fact that I've written about the cafe, because he always loved the cafe. But ultimately, he would not have been pleased at some of the things I uncovered about his lying. And I think the thing he would probably have done he would have reached for the nearest lawyer to sue me.
I just think that if you were my daughter, I would be so proud of you for writing this book.
Very kind.
I would be very, very proud. What would you? I always ask authors this, Mariel. What would you like the reader to take away from your book, The Lost Cafe Schindler? One Family, Two Wars, and the Search for Truth. What would you like for the readers to know?
I think there are two things. One I touched on earlier, which is that this is just a different way of telling the Holocaust story and keeping it alive as you're doing it through the eyes of the cafe. That's one thing. And the second thing, if I'm allowed a second thing, is that many of the themes in here, the themes of your neighbors turning on you, no matter how liked you are, no matter how successful you are, no matter how assimilated you are, this sort of hatred that lurks beneath the surface of society, it is quite easy to unleash it. And you look at America, you look at what happened on the 6th of January last year, and that level of hatred we need to be constantly vigilant. And it isn't just about anti-Semitism. This is also about, xenophobia and how you deal with, incomers into our society who come from elsewhere.
Yes, that's very true. And I hear that anti-Semitism is on the rise again in Europe and other places. As a grandchild of immigrants, my family, as I told you earlier, my mother's parents were kicked off their land. This is pre-World War I. And they came to America illegally. So I always say I'm a byproduct of illegal.
Wonderful. Yeah.
And I just have to thank you again, Meriel Schindler, for writing this book. I'm glad you were an accidental author and wanting to write this book and ended up writing such a phenomenal book. Where can people purchase this book?
So it's available from all good bookstores, all independent bookstores. It's been very widely distributed by my publishers, Norton, in the US. It's also available on Amazon, so you can get it there as well. And I've got an author website, which is merielschindler.com. And if people fancy writing to me, you can track me down at my law firm, which is meriel.schindler@withersworldwide.com. So I'm very easily trackable on the World Wide Web, and I always respond to emails from readers because I think it's a nice thing to do.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Meriel Schindler, for coming on, writing this book. I can't wait to see if your second act, another book that you write, because your first one, it's really out of the ballpark. It's so phenomenal. Folks, I want you to buy this book. I mean, run to Amazon.com on your computer, go to your local bookstore. See, I'm sure they'll order it for you if it's not available, and read this book, so rich in history that we're not taught anymore. I know my son was not taught about history. So, especially if you're a history buff, read this book. And if you're not, just read it anyway, because it is a wonderful, heart-touching story. And we must never forget the Holocaust. And I'm not just saying that because I'm Jewish, but we must never forget what hatred does and how frightening it is that a man like Hitler came into power and 6 million people were killed because of what they were. It's just a horrible part of history that we should never forget, because we don't want to repeat it. So I want to thank you again, Meriel Schindler, and I want to thank Lisa Warren, who is Meriel Schindler's publicist, who's president of Lisa Warren Public Relations. Thank you for arranging this wonderful interview. And I want to thank Jeannie White, station manager, Passion World Talk Radio Network, who produces the show, writes the blog. Please read the blog for information. And I want to thank Lillian Caldwell, CEO, Passion World Talk Radio Network, who makes this all possible. If you missed any of this podcast, you're going to want to hear this again. I am on your favorite podcast outlet, CastBox, Breaker, Spotify, to name just a few. It is free to subscribe to Chatting with Betsy, so I appreciate it if you subscribe. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing. Please share this podcast. It's just a wonderful book. I don't care if I sound redundant, because I'm passionate about this book, and I want people to read it. It's really phenomenal, and I just want to thank you again, Meriel Schindler. And folks, in a world where you could be anything, please be kind. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate World Talk Radio Network. Bye-bye now.